Now, our next panel will focus on China's engagement in security and law enforcement. And we all know that, of course, in the whole world, the 10 most violent cities in the whole world happen to reside in Latin America and the Caribbean. And of course, transnational criminal organizations are running rampant anywhere from Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel, Jalisco Nueva Generación, in Mexico, all the way down to various gangs that are deteriorating the security situation in Ecuador. And then of course, across the Atlantic, you have various countries in Africa where there's terrorism with Al-Shabaab, of course, coups with Niger being the most recent. And so there's a very real need for an increase in security cooperation. And in many ways, China is increasing its relationship in that field. We are seeing an increase in Chinese law enforcement donations, increase in Chinese training for police and various security forces, and of course the overseas Chinese police stations that are popping up in various cities in Africa and in Latin America and the Caribbean. We actually just put in the chat two reports, one from our colleague here, Paul Nantulya, about China's law enforcement engagement in Africa, and then one written by yours truly and my boss, Brian Fonseca, in a foreign policy report on Chinese law enforcement in Latin America and the Caribbean. But Paul is going to lead this discussion as moderator, and the other experts that we have on this panel is Obert Hodzi of the University of Liverpool. Obert, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. It's great to have you. Great to have you on the screen. We also have Elijah Munyi from the United States International University. Evan Ellis, of course, needs no introduction, from the U.S. Army War College, and Javier Melendez of Expediente Abierto. So Paul, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Leland. I'm very excited to be on this panel with colleagues that I've worked with for quite a bit of time. Evan and Elijah. Elijah teaches at the university where I did my undergraduate studies. So there's a special connection there. So in the previous session, our colleagues talked about the economic dimensions of Chinese engagement. This I think was an important curtain raiser, because one of the drivers of Chinese military law enforcement activity in Africa, and I guess this includes the security firms. People like to call them private security firms, but they are not private. They're connected to the state, and they're hired by state-owned enterprises. So they're not really private as such. But the point I'm making is all these activities are, the economic and financial dimensions of Chinese engagement are an important driver. We have seen the People's Republic of China becoming one of the continent's most important, the African continent's most important security and military partners. Between 2012, I believe, and 2018, over 2,000 African police, paramilitary, intelligence, and law enforcement personnel trained in different academies in the People's Republic of China. These are academies that are run by the People's Armed Police and the Ministry of Public Security, the MPS, which of course has a bigger budget than the People's Liberation Army. So that's an important area of engagement that is growing. It's being looked at by different African professionals, and it would be very interesting to find out what this engagement looks like in Latin America. What is happening? Because on the African continent, it's mostly memoranda of understanding between the Ministry of Public Security and counterparts like Lesotho. Ethiopia just signed one last year, which allows for the deployment of Chinese law enforcement in different ways and different functions. So it would be interesting to find out what the story is in Latin America. On the military side, professional military education has become critically important. The Chinese don't use the term professional military education, but nevertheless, the idea being, to take African officers to different academies in the People's Republic, to take, short courses, but then also long courses, some of them leading to master's level. And again, that has become a key area. Initially, China was a little shy, but now that has become a big area in Africa. At least 2,000 officers, 2,000 slots are offered to African countries to train in the People's Republic. And these are countries that range from militaries that were ideologically close to the People's Liberation Army, like Tanzania, South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, and countries that were either pro-West or neutral, countries like Kenya, Botswana. Botswana has trained about 500 officers in the People's Republic of China since the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation started. Kenya is another very important partner. Liberia has become a very important partner, at least 36 military slots every year. So this has become a critical area of engagement. And so this panel becomes extremely key. One would like to see, again, what are the parallels? What parallels do you find? What similarities? Are there any similarities? Are there any lessons that might be learned? And any cross-pollination of ideas in terms of what the People's Republic of China and its armed forces would like to achieve. So with that, I think we will go in order. So I will introduce our colleague Ellis, research professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, focuses on China's relationships with non-Western hemisphere actors, as well as transnational organized crime and populism in the region. He previously served on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff with responsibility for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as international narcotics and law enforcement issues. That's in his policy capacity. In his academic capacity, he has presented his work in a broad range of business and government forums in 27 countries on 4 continents. He does have a very active listserv. Thank you, Ellis. I voraciously read your documents. He's given a testimony on Latin America to the US Congress on various occasions, and he's discussed his work regarding China and other external actors in Latin America. Evan, karibu sana, as we say in Kiswahili, very welcome, and over to you.
Paul, thank you very much. And also thanks to FIU and the team for this wonderful opportunity. I think as a comparativist myself in my own PhD work, just the opportunity to make these comparisons and learn from them and bring these two groups of regional experts together is particularly valuable. Let me lay out a number of key points. I've tried to respond to the questions that Paul and others have put in the panel. I'll go quickly just to lay out some of these things in the interest of time. So just a couple topics. First of all, broadly, security engagement, when we look in Latin America at the PRC and international organizations, of course, they are in virtually every international organization in Latin America at the regional and sub-regional level. Oftentimes trying, first of all, to prevent those organizations from having reports that do harm to the PRC, and where possible, like with the IADB, to try to use those through things like co-financing funds for their advantage. But specific to IO roles in security, they're really, for example, the Chinese have an active presence at the Organization of American States since 2004, but you really have not seen participation in the established Inter-American security system. About a decade ago, they had a student at the Inter-American Defense College, but was widely seen by most of his partners as a Chinese spy, and eventually the Chinese decided not to continue sending somebody to the IDB. The Chinese multilaterally mostly work through CELAC, and although they mentioned the engagement with CELAC within their most recent white paper on the Global Security Initiative, as well as collaborating through BRICS Plus, not mentioning, I would point out, collaboration with the established Inter-American system. They do in CELAC do work on a number of different things. They mention security cooperation in the China-CELAC plans. And they have a number of different committees where they often do a lot of their sub-ministerial level work that are relevant to security collaboration. And specifically, I would mention, first of all, the Defense Forum, which has met at the defense minister level at least 5 times over the past couple of years, as well as a disaster relief committee, which creates opportunity not only for IT projects and possibly construction projects for disaster resilience, but they also are actively looking for opportunities to work with the different ministries within Latin America and the Caribbean that are responsible for supporting disaster relief operations. And so that inherently ties it into the police and defense and others. Also, the Chinese have a people-to-people cooperation forum, which also brings security-oriented think tank professionals from Latin America to the PRC in ways that are often below the radar, as well as, of course, there is a proposed, not sure if it's gone forward yet, a space collaboration forum, which complements some of the defense dimensions of space. One of the other topics that I was asked about to mention was, of course, some of the new initiatives, the BRI, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative. First of all, the formulation here shows that the PRC concept is global, although it includes Latin America. Also, I'm not sure how well the what they call the community of common destiny will play out in terms of the public messaging. But what you see, first of all, the BRI obviously is still alive in Latin America. October 16th and 17th, they're doing their forum. I understand that a number of Latin American leaders are there for that. However, in security terms, it's interesting, the Global Development Initiative. This is, in my judgment, in many ways, a shift away from BRI and a return to the more political, making common cause with the developing world that Africa knows well, and that you see with Guyana, Suriname, and some recently post-colonial countries in the Caribbean especially. In addition to that, although I would say GDI has not gotten a lot of traction beyond just people saying they're part of it, other than the mentions at the recent G77 plus China forum in Havana, Cuba, just a couple of weeks ago. And I would mention this shows the dilemma. G77 plus China is the title. So China wants to make common cause with the developing world, and yet at the same time, it likes to hold itself apart as a bit special, not entirely with the developing world. The Global Security Initiative, I would note that one of the key issues is the inclusion of data control and data security issues, showing, I think, inherently that the Chinese understand data and the data architectures that they control in Latin America and elsewhere as strategic. And also, again, the fact that they explicitly named CELAC and BRICS as their preferred organizations for security engagement and not the established inter-American system in which the US and Canada have a role. They also, of course, in naming BRICS, it suggests that there may be some synergies between Latin America and Africa in that cooperation. And in the interest of time, just to mention Global Security Initiative, in a way, it seems to promote China's interest in democracy and human rights, but it's an unenforceable concept of democracy and human rights that at the end of the day, if you can't say that Russia's invasion of the Ukraine is bad, if you can't say that there is any right and wrong in what's going on right now in Israel and in the Gaza Strip and in many other areas in Venezuela, it really in many ways disarms that agenda. With respect to peacekeeping, this has come up, of course, the first and only foray of Chinese peacekeepers in Latin America was in the MINUSTAH peacekeeping force in Haiti, 2004 to 2012. My sense is, of course, this is much, much less than the Chinese activities in Africa in peacekeeping. But what you see is they did not have a good experience. One could argue in Haiti, they had a number of casualties in the 2010 earthquake. They withdrew without explanation after 2012. And recently, the Kenya-led peacekeeping force, the Chinese and Russians had basically a soft veto until at the end of the day, they actually both abstained from the UNSC resolution. And of course, notably this time, the Chinese, at least to the best of my knowledge, didn't offer up Chinese participation in this peacekeeping force. And so that might be something that they have backed away from to some extent in Latin America. In terms of other security, as in Africa, you see the use of a lot of memorandums of understanding frameworks. The PRC has long generally announced its interest in its 2015 Defense Strategy White Paper, its 2008 and 2016 China-Latin America White Papers, as well as in SLAC Forum. So it doesn't make a secret about the interest in the engagement, although it's not very specific. By contrast to Djibouti in Africa, the PRC has no official bases in Latin America, although there's a lot of attention, of course, to the operation of the upcoming port of Chancay as a dual-use port. With respect to military sales, I would notice that the biggest sales, as in other parts of the world, have gone to populist nations. So the K-8 fighters to Venezuela, the radars to Venezuela and Ecuador, et cetera, the big truck sales to Rafael Correa in Ecuador. I would note that in Latin America, you've seen in the military sales deals, there's been a lot of problems with corruption, both the Bolivia K-8 helicopter the helicopter deal, as well as the Peru T-90B MLRS system deal was associated with corruption overpayment scandals. There have also been repeating problems with manuals and support. At least 2 of the K-8s that crashed in Venezuela, it was blamed in part on bad manuals. And the issue with the FC-1 fighter in Argentina, when the previous government walked away from the deal, access to the manuals and tech specs was one of the key issues. The Chinese also are very active in advancing their interest in mil-mil and police relationships through gifts. So even Colombia under Alvaro Uribe, but the Guyana Defense Force, they give tractors to ambulances, trucks, and really across the nation, you see everything from personal protective equipment given to Panama and Costa Rica, to vehicles, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, the Dominican Republic Police Service, countless others. It really has become a way of opening the door. And I would call attention to the fact that also the gifting of basically IT systems in several different cases, and some of the vulnerabilities that creates. This seems to be a new theme that the Chinese are exploring. Training in PME, I would mention that like in other parts of the world, virtually everyone in Latin America that recognizes the PRC sends people to the 3 to 5 week short courses in Chongqing. Sometimes, as Paul mentioned, some of the longer courses as well in Nanjing, and some specialty courses like a special operations force in Xizhuang. I think we're seeing an uptick, especially with some of the more populist anti-US countries like Nicaragua, in beginning to increase police training, but you're also seeing others. The recently concluded Global Security Forum, in which I believe there was both African participation and at least, I believe, Guyanese and Suriname participation, suggests that there are some new initiatives there. With respect to presence, we have not seen in Latin America the deployment of Chinese forces in a police role, as you see in Africa, as was mentioned. But what you do see is, for example, presence like the visits of ships, defense attachés on some occasions, and of course the ELINT base in Cuba and the possibility of Cuban training. You do see some activity by Chinese in the tech space with smart cities in the security realm. As was mentioned before, you're beginning to see Chinese private security companies. Leland did an excellent report, basically using his ability to read the Chinese language, just going through Baidu and things, and came up with some great insights, and really showed up that although China is much more present in Africa and Asia in private security companies, you do find some like China Security Technology Group, Beijing Duzhui Security, even something called the Mexico-Chinese Security Council. So kind of nibbling, trying to prepare themselves to get more involved. But at the end of the day, Latin American regulations and a lack of experience seems to limit them from being competitive against the larger and like companies like Proseguir and some of the Israeli companies. Although companies like Hikvision, Huawei, and Dahua in the security systems sales space seem to be active. And then just to wrap up a few final things here, the humanitarian response, the PRC has been notably bad in Latin America. Of course, we heard a lot about the COVID vaccines. Oftentimes when there is a hurricane in the Caribbean, you'll see they'll donate small amounts of money. However, in terms of actually having a presence on the ground to be helpful to bring aid, they just don't have the logistics infrastructure or the style to be very effective. That's an area. The only thing that you really see comparatively in the space is occasionally, now 3 times, they've brought their hospital ship, the Peace Ark, to the region, especially with multiple stops in the Caribbean. Although the quality of those stops by comparison to the USS Comfort are probably not the best. We'll save things like best practices for later in the interest of time. But again, trends: defense going to security cooperation, gifts, technology component, security training on the uptick, disaster relief, space, and some increase in private security companies in the region are the trends that we're seeing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very, very comprehensive. So let's shift gears from Latin America and go to Africa. If Obert is still online, I would like to invite him. Obert, Hodzi.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me clearly.
Let me introduce you first. International relations scholar, focusing on international politics, conflict and security, and non-Western emerging powers in global governance, with empirical expertise on China and Africa. He joined the University of Liverpool in September of 2019. Prior to that, he was a postdoc researcher at the University of Helsinki, Finland. He's been a visiting researcher at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies, the Nordic Africa Institute, Renmin University of China, and the Africa Studies Center at Boston University. Obert has worked for international regional organizations in Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Germany on democratic governance and transitional justice projects, and he is admitted as a legal practitioner in the High Court of Zimbabwe. Obert, over to you, sir.
All right, thank you very much. So I think Ivan has given a very comprehensive view of what is happening in Latin America, and most of it is kind of like similar to what is happening in African countries. But what I'll try to do here is to give you perhaps things that we may need to think about as things are developing in African countries, the military coups, the resentment towards military forces being present in African countries. The first thing is that there's a security deficit in Africa, and the current military coups has to some extent demonstrated that security deficit, that regimes are not as secure as they seem to be. And China's engagement with African countries was based on the belief that African governments are strong enough or competent enough to protect Chinese investments and to protect Chinese interests. But what happened in Libya, what has happened in Mali, in Sudan, is to some extent demonstrated that political situation in Africa is not stable, and therefore there's a security deficit. And how is that deficit going to be filled in? The second thing is what I would say the resentment in Africa as a result of this wave of military coups towards the presence of any foreign militaries or foreign security services in African countries. Part of it is because of the public opinions that, these foreign militaries are there to take over African countries, or some kind of like neo-colonialism of some sense, and being hyped by political leaders who are perhaps anti-Chinese, anti-French, and to some extent the Chinese are quite sensitive on how they are perceived in Africa, particularly because of the political baggage in African countries, the colonial history as well. So it's quite sensitive for China, and it's quite careful on how it engages in security in African countries. The third thing linked to the military coups is the challenging of democracy, the challenging of human rights as systems that are important to governance and political stability. And how do these things create opportunities for China to rethink the models that it has been following? To some extent, they are sending troops through the United Nations. We've seen demonstrations in the DRC against UN peacekeepers. And China, noticing all these things, I think there is a feeling that there is need to rethink engagement with African countries, not necessarily trying, and not trying to go against the public opinion, reading what the public opinion in African countries and trying to ride on that. The fourth thing, possibly the fourth thing that I want to mention, is that in most of the security challenges involving Chinese businesses, Chinese interests at a broad scale in African countries, China has often tended to take a cue from the African Union or from regional organizations, ECOWAS, SADC, and the like. But what the schools have demonstrated is that there is no longer consensus on how to deal with political challenges, with conflict and security in African countries by those regional organizations. ECOWAS demonstrated that clearly. What do we do with Niger? They were not quite clear on how to do that. And without that, without the AU, without ECOWAS and SADC taking a cue and a decisive position on how to deal with political instability in African countries, China is to some extent left in a mess. How do they respond in a way that they are not seen as intervening without the support of these the support of these regional organizations? Now, linking it to the Global Civilization Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, I think this is China to some extent revamping its message, rebranding itself and saying, we will respond to issues based on the characteristics of a country, based on the context of a country, and most importantly, demand from a country. And we have seen this in African countries. The Zimbabwean government, for instance, makes requests for the Chinese government to support it in building a defense university or defense institution, or work with the military, for instance, in diamond mining and stuff like that. So it's responding to those demands. And what it basically does for China is enabling it to maneuver this intervention, non-intervention kind of thinking to say, we are not necessarily intervening. We are there because we have been invited by the regimes to participate in those things. But those initiatives, they also is a way of China saying they are there to provide public goods that perhaps Western countries are not able to provide at the moment, particularly on what I would perhaps say the double standards in some sense. And I'm kind of like finishing off now. The South African foreign minister was recorded, and she said this. She said, one of the biggest challenges in the world today is how to understand the rules-based international system. Whose rules are we following, and who is anchoring this international system? And her argument is, when it comes to sovereignty, when it comes to intervention and all those things, aggression, all the things that we've been talking about, when Russia intervenes in or is aggressive towards Ukraine, there's an uproar. But when the same thing happens to Palestine, it's a different thing. So the rules change depending on who is being affected. And how does this benefit China in some way? Its Global Security Initiative is its way of saying, we understand there are global security challenges, there are also local security challenges. And to respond to local security challenges, we will not intervene, but we will take a cue on what the local actors in that country want us to do. And they will meet that demand. So demand-based kind of conflict resolution, providing security goods that these countries may need. So perhaps I can stop here and then respond to questions if we have time.
Obert, thank you very much. That is a very interesting 4-point framework that you've provided, which is quite interesting to look at the different ways in which China is trying to adjust to different security and military realities on the continent. With your permission, colleagues, let me move to Javier Melendez, because I would like to balance the Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, so that we get that flavor of cross-pollination. Javier is an analyst at Expediente Abierto, an emerging Central American think tank focused on research and dialogue on security and defense, international affairs, transparency, and human rights. This organization brings together researchers and practitioners from the hemisphere to generate analyses without political affiliation, very important, and that seek to contribute to the discussion of topics of general interest in society, such as security, public sector efficiency, institutional opacity, organized crime, corruption, and control of public resources. So, Brother Javier, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to everyone. I just want to remark that what I would say is much more the perspective of a practitioner like me that have been involved in different situations in Central America regarding human rights, security, and much more than approach coming from a scholar. No? So my words will be related to the situation we have now in Central America with China, of course, that for most of the people that are compromised with the rule of law, transparency, obviously China is bringing a lot of concern to us because precisely after, I would say, you will see that there is a relationship between China and autocrat regime there in Central America that we feel that is not good for us at all, no? If you see the map there in the screen, you will see that our relation with China is new. I mean, the first country that open relation with China was Costa Rica in 2007. And the last year, Honduras, it was the last country that kicked off Taiwan and embraced China. I'm pretty sure that the next one will be Guatemala. I talked with a very close advisor for the next president. I don't know if he will be Bernardo Arevalo. And she told me that they will be pragmatic. They will take decision based on the best interest of Guatemala. But after I see the numbers, the logic of the relation that China has with these countries, I don't see that any good interest that we can pretend to be changing to China, no? Pessimist is I'm giving you the perspective from Central America, so for sure most of you will not agree with that. In August 2023, the Parliament of the Central American Integration System, in Parlacen in Spanish, which includes 6 Central American countries, vote to revoke Taiwan's permanent observer status and admit China as an observer in its place. This action is part of market strategy by China to reinforce their presence in Central America. In the next minutes, I will focus on 2 aspects that are of overriding importance in the evolution of relation between PRC and Central America. First, the consolidation of autocratic regime that increasingly opposed to the United States, and second, the dispute of the historical hegemony of the United States through aggressive strategy for propaganda and disinformation. I would say that the growing presence of China in Central America could not take place, of course, without the acquiescence of political elites who urgently wishing to advance and strengthen the authoritarian practice in Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador, see this relation an opportunity to circumvent the norms agreed upon by the international community in terms of democratic practice, accountability-oriented environments, and respect for civil and political rights. When it comes to China and Central America, you can find certain narratives that has been spread aggressively throughout the Central American media there in the region. For example, in articles and reports from Central American journalists, local political elites assured to the citizens that a relationship with China will significantly enhance and boost their country trade performance. For example, as you can see in the second slide, for example, after the visit by 30 journalists to China in May, just a few months ago, a journalist piece of the Honduran newspaper La Tribuna stated that China is ready to open its $137 billion checkbook to buy Honduran products. That is the kind of expectation that the media are disseminating in the region. And a pro-government television channel also in the country, in Honduras, quote a government advisor saying that China has the capacity to make Honduran dreams come true. Yeah, this is the third one, I think, sorry. However, the evidence is showing a different picture on the trade between China and Central America. In 2007, for example, when Costa Rica made the decision to break diplomatic relations with Taiwan in favor of China, the trade balance of the Central American country was positive by about $100 million. Can you go back to the second one? In 2022, 11 years into a free trade agreement, Costa Rica has a trade deficit of nearly $3 billion with China. In 2021, during a visit to Washington, D.C., Christian Guillemer, who was served as a vice minister of multilateral affairs during the Carlos Alvarado government, stated that, the contrary to what is expected, I'm opening quote, our relationship with China has not been commercially successful as we saw. The case of El Salvador exported to China in 2022 were only less than $50 million, while export to the United States were $1.6 billion. In fact, export in 2022 from Central America to China were less than $2 billion, while the region trade deficit during the same year was almost $14 billion. In El Salvador, Chinese diplomat and President Nayib Bukele, along with his closest political operators, have maintained a consistent Chinese narrative announcing billions of dollars in donation, non-refundable cooperation, and investment in construction projects all over El Salvador. In Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador, China is finding a new window of opportunities, sharing with these countries a critical discourse aimed to building a new order based on multipolarity. Of course, Xi Jinping is assuming leadership. In this way, China seeks to deploy an array of cultural, academic, and above all, communication exchange to position its interests among the political and economic elite and consolidate their illiberal narrative there in Central America. In China's geopolitical strategy, Central America represents an addition to an opportunity to expand its political influence through economic coercion, the possibility of broadcasting a favorable idea of the sale of the war to the war. The diplomatic relationship with El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua is an important component in expanding the global vision, the Asian nation as a beneficent and future power. I would say that one of the key aspects of the relation with China and Central America is that the key actors in this diplomatic relation are members of the family circle of this autocratic president in Central America. In Nicaragua, for instance, relations with the People's Republic of China and also Russia are overseen by Laureano Ortega, the son of Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo. In El Salvador, Karim Bukele, one of the president's brothers, is the person in charge of supervising this relationship. In fact, all of President Bukele's brothers are trusted advisors dispersed among practically all the institutions on the Salvador state. The delegation that have traveled to China have included in Honduras, the delegation that have traveled to China have included two President Castro's children, Hortensia Castro, who is representative in the parliament, and Héctor Zelaya, who holds the position of private secretary of the president. Hortensia Zelaya Castro, besides that, was appointed by Xiomara Castro to oversee relations with the Chinese Communist Party. In this framework of clientelism and opaque relation with China, Nicaragua and Honduras has signed no less than 40 agreements between December 2021 and March 2023 on such issues as housing, transportation, trade, and communication. The public knows just little about the scope or terms of this agreement, several of which include confidentiality clause. For example, in Honduras, the Honduran telecommunication company Hondutel and the Chinese company Huawei signed an agreement that included a confidentiality clause that forced Hondutel to administer this new relation in secret. The idea that I want to deliver in the best possible way here is that Chinese president should cause us concern. It will be exacerbate abuse of power, because it will be exacerbate abuse of power, corruption, and clientelist networks. We also be experiencing an increase in anti-Western rhetoric through local elites and pro-government media, which will continue to build up the benefit of the Chinese model and discredit the values of liberal democracies. The Chinese state, Xinhua News Agency, and China Global Television Network are already playing vital roles in this regard through a policy of large numbers of trips and scholarships to China for journalists, agreement and training on the ground. Chinese state media and the Communist Party are sharing best practices and experiences of propaganda, disinformation, and espionage against independent journalists. I will keep repeating as much as necessary that the effect of China presence and impact depend finally on accountability mechanism and practice in partner countries, as someone said before. In countries with strong independent institutions and where accountability, human rights, and an independent press prevail, Chinese presence could be beneficial. However, in countries like the countries in Central America right now, where the norm is for regimes to hide information and crush public freedoms, the consequence will be concrete. China will use these countries to increase its predatory presence, contribute to strengthening illiberal regimes, and encourage countries' narratives of conflict against the United States and the West. Finally, I will say that in terms of defense, security cooperation, I think that I cannot add that much that after event. I will say that particularly in Central America, China has not been very successful in defense and security approach there. It has the potential to become more active. Washington and General Richardson views with concern the possibility of China establishing a military base in the region. For me, is so far pretty realistic. The donation of defense and security equipment, as well as in-person and virtual meeting and conference, are helping to increase and cement relations between China Armed Forces with their counterpart in the Western Hemispheres. In conversation I had with my good friends Ralph Espak from CNA and Ryan Baer of CSIS, they can say that China has not been very active in the defense area in Central America, but it has the potential to become more active. For now, Chinese defense relations with our region are limited. There's no sale of arms, there's no war power, but there is a very strong war to disturb the interests and influence of the United States in Central America and the Caribbean. A possible Chinese military presence in Central America and the Caribbean would focus on the naval. Instead of thinking about military installation with tanks or anti-missile system, it should be remembered that maritime control is an interest of Beijing, not only in the Western Hemisphere, but also globally. After interview with several experts in defense and security, I agree with them that so far China is not interested in sending military force to Nicaragua or El Salvador. It is not yet the time. The Chinese government strategy is to compromise corrupt governments and subsequently obtain control of the country. The government of Maduro in Venezuela, Ortega in Nicaragua, and Bukele in El Salvador are examples of how effective this strategy could be. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Javier. Lots of common points which we shall discuss in the question and answer. Let's very quickly go to Elijah Munyi. Obtained a PhD in international relations from Aalborg University in Denmark. He's currently an assistant professor of international relations at my alma mater, United States International University in Nairobi. His research interests are Africa's international economic relations. And I should say that he's written a paper which is probably one of the few studies of its kind that looks at defense procurement trends in Africa, why certain countries decide to procure military and defense equipment from the People's Republic of China versus Western countries. And that's a very interesting comparative study. But Elijah, I will not speak on your behalf. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yeah, thank you. This is a great place to be, and I'm very glad to be here. And many thanks to all the organizers, Rilad from here, and Paul and SSRC and the rest. When I did my PhD, one of my panel's committee members, Juliana, was from your institution, and that was many years ago. And so I was just telling Paul how happy I am to be sort of connected again to Flasco and what you do at Argentina. I think it's a great forum because Latin America, I don't know what's the right name, Latin America or South America, as you know, has been very influential in Africa in providing sort of an analytical model or matrix of how to think about relations with great powers, which is basically what I study. My PhD was on trade relations, and during that time we were having negotiations for economic partnership agreements between African countries and the EU, and some of the models that also were applicable in the Caribbean. But you know, the whole thing about dependency and dependencia now has come to be very influential again in African scholarship, at least. I think it's going to become more pronounced going forward, because there's a new re-examination of China's thinking about the dual circulation idea. Is it an illiberal or idea for trade? And therefore, how is China helping African states in sort of moving from a spatial classification as a peripheral country to a more manufacturing-oriented country? And sort of the jury seems to be, probably from the earlier discussion, it's not doing very well. Yeah, but what I would like to talk about are the sort of to go into the thinking of how African governments are thinking about security. And African governments thinking about security is not so different from African governments thinking about economic relations with China, the panel we had before. So the question, one of the things that I like to study is what ideas drive African policy decision makers on how they relate with China or the United States and so on. And I would like to focus on 3 ideas. That is on overall strategic objective of the US versus China and how that is taken by African states. The second one is on how African states think about security in relation to China and the United States. And the third is the whole idea of democracy and governance and stability relating to sort of the coups we've been having recently, and how these 3 ideas then affect some of the more practical things about military sales on domestic non-state actors like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram in Nigeria, and on the next level sort of competition, which is technological based. So on the first one, strategic thinking on China-Africa relations or Africa-US relations. I think one of the interesting things about why China is very attractive is because I think there's generally very good understanding about what China's strategic objective is, which is at least according to African understanding, countering hegemony, countering US hegemony. So the question then becomes, how does that drive their security considerations, their security partnerships with China? With the US, probably it's very clear on the US side. It's about freedom and democracy. At least that's how it's seen, and that is the good way of seeing it. Freedom and democracy sometimes can be seen as imperialism in a way, and therefore it becomes a little bit negative. But on the whole strategic, what is the whole thing about? What is China about? China is about countering US, and in the view of many African states, then they would say, we like that idea. We would like to balance things a little bit. Then the second idea is on security. I think this is more about how does the US think about security, how does China think about security, and which ideas sort of resonate better with African countries. The way I think about the US thinking about security is the word strategic. So the US wants to be very sort of clear about why we want to invest here, why we want to invest here, and so on. The way China thinks about security is very commercial. We want to sell arms. We want we want any countries that is interested in technology, we are willing to provide them as much as possible. And then the question then becomes, how do then African countries perceive that and use that for their own objectives? And the third idea is on democracy and governance. And I think the question here is, I think the jury is out there. So who provides better stability of countries, especially when we've started seeing the kind of thing that's happening with the coup d'etats in West Africa? What kind of governments and institutions provide the stability that we need as China or the United States to continue dealing with them in a sort of more sustainable way? So for the US, of course, they want democracy. So they want democratic, they focus on ensuring democratic governments. For China, I think they focus on stability and they don't really emphasize what kind of government they want. Actually, they say it's non-intervention. And the idea of non-intervention, again, resonates very well with many, I think, people in power. So then when you think about these three ideas on security, commercial versus strategic, on broad strategic objective, countering hegemony versus freedom and democracy, and on what governments provide stability and better governance, then we come to the African side and ask, how do those three ideas generally affect or influence how governments think about military sales? So from the research and the paper that Paul was talking about, I was curious about when Kenya buys arms, when Uganda buys arms, when Algeria buys arms, when Senegal procures military arms, do they really think like where we need to buy these arms from? Actually, I think Russia as of today still holds the number one position in terms of arms procurement by African states. And number two then comes China. So a lot of countries have been moving towards procurement from China. And the question is, why is this the case? And from my studies, I did the research using Kenya and Uganda. The reasons came down to two things. One is cost. So many countries will not think strategically like we need to procure military jets from either US or China. We just need jets. If we need jets, the person who provides them cheaper, we go to China. So in terms of if countries are buying jets for state-based conflicts, potential conflicts between states, then China becomes very key in providing the solutions to those in terms of, for example, what's happening in DRC and potentials for countries fighting countries there. So in terms of state-to-state possibilities for conflict, I think China becomes very important. And the US, I think, is trying to compete, but is finding it a bit difficult in terms of its perceived problems with its very strict oversight measures. So because of the second point about China's commercial approach, then China again becomes very attractive in how countries want to procure their military. When it comes to domestic non-state actors, like in Kenya, where I come from, we've got Al-Shabaab, which is very problematic. I think this is one of the areas where you could say there is a lot of potential synergy for China and the United States in how they can help countries like Kenya or Ethiopia or Somalia. So all these governments want the elimination of these non-state actors like Al-Shabaab. And actually, recently, the Chinese, I think 2021, the Chinese, for example, for the first time nominated an ambassador for peace in the Horn. So we've got an ambassador who is stationed in Nairobi who works on peace in the Horn of Africa. I think this is one of the areas where we could have a lot of synergy. But a problem comes in because as we speak now in Kenya, we, for example, had an Al-Shabaab military supplier who was arrested in Kenya and has just vanished. So how is this person somehow able to procure arms for Al-Shabaab? It's that very commercial approach of the Chinese, which asks questions about the Chinese state oversight of their own businesses and how well they can control those so as to ensure their military procurement is going to the right people. So I think that is a weakness on the Chinese side, and it's sort of a weakness driven by that overly commercial predisposition for selling arms to whoever wants to buy them. And then finally is on the issue of what Ivan briefly touched on, which is this idea of gifting and telecoms, the telecoms competition. Again, I think on the African side, I think are a bit short on the strategic ends of this telecoms competition and where it's going. And therefore, when the Chinese offer something, when the Chinese offer something as a gift, it's very easily taken. So in Kenya, for example, this idea of smart cities and 5G, over the last 10 years now, we are doing our third round of smart card registration. So it's some kind of citizen registration, which is using Chinese technology. And every government that comes in seems to be keen on making a new one. And when you speak to people from the Communications Authority of Kenya, they tell you things are safe, but the Chinese have gifted them these technologies to be able to run those applications and those registrations. So I think it's where the competition is in terms of many African countries, and I think in this case China seems to have an upper hand because of its very, very commercial approach, and that resonates quite well with most African countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. These were very rich presentations. It's a little difficult to summarize them, but I think I'll just point out a few common threads. The PRC's effort to position itself as a preferred security partner through, among other things, attractive cost packages, attractive credits to buy military hardware, and I suspect this might be the same thing that is happening in Latin America. It would be interesting for colleagues from Latin America and the Caribbean to weigh in on that. This whole idea of if I partner with a PRC, I will be assisting in combating US influence or US leadership, the extent to which that is attractive to African countries. I think we see that in the patterns of how African countries' voting behavior in the United Nations, in these institutions, sometimes reflects that. And I think there are times when those blocks also coincide with blocks from Asia, especially South Asia and Latin America, and so that is also quite interesting, and it has a security underpinning. Javier, all the issues you talked about, I would say, have a security underpinning. The promotion of narratives, which you also see in Africa, Taiwan, Taiwan is very important. If you read any defense or security agreement that China signs with African countries, the first clause is reiterating support for the one China principle, and that there's only one China, and that China is the People's Republic of China. So I paid a lot of attention to that. The issue of building a new order, the GDI, socializing the GDI, the recent China-Africa Defense Forum. This was the topic. The topic was socializing the GDI and developing the GDI as an instrument to shape security cooperation. So I think on the African side, we're seeing the GDI and the GSI now becoming practical initiatives. It would be interesting to see how far that has gone in Latin America. Opaque agreements, that has also been a problem in Africa. Scholarships, potential. We begin to see journalists reporting in a particular way after they've attended these very extensive journalism fellowship programs. Some of those talk about security. The question of buyer's remorse to me is very interesting, because if you look at what is happening in Nigeria, for instance, there have been complaints that some of that equipment that was provided to fight Boko Haram was just not durable. It was just not durable. So there were complaints about that. So many things, autocratic regimes, yes. Circumvention, yes, we see that in Africa, countries like Eritrea, and that has a security underpinning because these governments tend to be unpopular. And we've seen a rise in protest in Africa over the past 10 years. So there's a sense that China is aligning with regimes that are subverting democracy. That creates problems, security problems, because those security forces, those very forces that are equipped by the PRC, the different entities in the PRC are cracking down on these individuals. Obert, smart cities. Again, we see that in Africa, lots of ICT MOUs, peacekeeping operations. The vast majority of Chinese deployed peacekeepers are in Africa. The Chinese seem to think that that can provide some kind of security cover for their economic interests. Bases, which is something that I forgot to mention at the beginning. Yes, so there's a lot of overlap, and certainly lots to talk about. So I think I'll turn it over to the floor for question and answers. I'm not sure how much time we have, but let's just move ahead. So I see a hand up here on this table. I see another hand there. I see a third hand at the back. So let's just begin with those three. Yeah, those are the first three hands that I see. Okay.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Samuel. I'm part of the Jack D. Gordon Institute, one of the partners for this event. My question is, from what I see, there are some African states, countries that are using, sort of leveraging or building their relationship with China as part of like a political point, right, to counter US hegemony. But also I see states that instead of China, they're actually developing their relations in terms of security, usually with Russia, to counter US hegemony. So which one is more common, would you say, in that sort of political point that they try to score, or that narrative in their governments? Thank you.
Okay, I think let's take the other two questions and then just throw them to the panel. So there's a question here.
Hi, my name is Julie Jingzhen. I'm from Florida International University. And I have two sets of questions. The first question is about cost of Chinese technologies. And just now you mentioned that many countries that do not think strategically and they choose Chinese arms, military equipment because of the low cost. But I wonder whether there are hidden costs, because Russia used to be the #1 provider of those military equipment. So how does this competition unfold in the African context, and whether what role does the United States play, and whether there's any retaliation or penalty that from Russia towards the countries which choose China instead of Russia? And the second set of questions is about gifts. So you mentioned that when China offered those technologies as gifts, African countries took them, for example, 5G, smart cities. But I wonder whether, can you elaborate a little bit more? Are they really gifts for free, or is just maybe part of the equipment as gifts, but then Chinese companies like Huawei, ZTE, they need to compete against Ericsson and Nokia in order to win those projects that through this competitive bidding process. And I also want to ask the perception. You mentioned how Chinese government perceive the issue more commercially, American companies more about democracy. But how about African countries, those recipient countries? How do they perceive this securitization of the IT technology? For example, United States would argue that Huawei could be the tool for Chinese government to spy on the recipient countries. So do many African countries agree with that, or they have very different views? Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a third question on this table.
Thank you, Juan Manuel Aguilar from National Autonomous University of Mexico. It's a pleasure to hear Ivan, Elliot, and Orbs. Maybe to Javier. I have a little question related that there is a lot of problem around the rule of law state in Latin America and Africa. For example, we have corruption, poverty, political instability, violence. And in this way, if we have a traditional approach related to economic development, we can understand that a country had a development rate growth in the years, it could be solved these problems. But in this case, it's a fact that China, it's an important partner that it could be provide solution in economic development to African and Latin American regions. In this way, I have the question, consider that China is not a traditional rule maker in terms of political science of American or political science of the United States. We have examples that, for example, influence or economical influence of China impacts in these indicators, poverty, political stability, violence, because the use of IT technologies, it could be a solution. For example, we saw this condition of surveillance in Africa countries to improve the public security. We saw the use of smart cities to reduce criminality or terrorism, but we can understand that it could be different perspective. Maybe it could be positive or negative results, and maybe consider that Latin American countries and African countries, there are nations that are considered rule takers. So how can influence, it could be measure, it could be very, very interesting. I love index, I love indicators, I love different calculations, and it could exist an instrument or case of study that is influenced positive or negative in both regions that you know.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I'll leave it up to you to decide who goes first. There were quite a number of questions. Yeah, we could go in the same order. Yeah.
Okay, a lot of great questions. Very briefly, first of all, China versus Russia. Indeed, in Latin America, about a quarter of the Latin American helicopter fleet was Russia. You have a couple different issues. Number one, right now, because of sanctions, it's very difficult for our partners, Colombia and others, Mexico, to actually maintain their helicopters without busting sanctions. Obviously, Russian training and doctrine has not showed well in Ukraine. I think that's hurt Russia. But even going back to partners like Venezuela, their experience with the Sukhoi 30s, for example, they discovered that although the Chinese tech was cheaper, the Russians was more sturdy. There was a concern that the Chinese beat out the Russians in terms of deep pockets. Rospro on export and Rostec, could not finance partners like Venezuela after they ran out of money. The Chinese could do that financing, and the Chinese have gotten their quality up, although there are still issues. With respect to some of the hidden kind of costs of Chinese technologies. There have been, it's interesting, in Latin America, there's a lot of concern about the relationship with the United States. In other words, I think more than Africa, which has, because of the different history, this idea that Latin American defense partners, they're reluctant, like Argentina right now, to choose the Chinese system because they understand that that implies a long-term training relationship, a long-term spares relationship, and so a long-term choice of moving away from the United States. I think we've been more successful in using that weight of interest in a relationship in Latin America than Africa. And the Chinese do have a tendency to beat out the US and others on costs, but there have consistently been issues, especially in Latin America, with the availabilities of spare parts, technical issues, and other things. With respect to gifts, I was referring specifically to gifts in the security domain. In the commercial domain, Huawei and ZTE are less active in gifting, although they gave gifts during COVID of non-tech things and some cameras and things like that. But in general, in Latin America, the tendency is using the gifts to open up the relationship with the police officials, open up the relationship with the security officials, and things like that. A couple of interesting points that came up. Number one, the issue of control. Interesting, this was mentioned in the Africa context. Several years ago in Colombia, there was a problem where Norinco actually ended up indirectly, accidentally selling arms to the FARC. And so the Chinese have had issues with this in Latin America as well, although I understand they're getting more control. With respect to the question on the UNAM, the question on IIT, I think in Latin America, the big dominant area is in private security companies, home security, where across Latin America, Hikvision and Dahua are dominant, some integrated Huawei solutions. Secondarily, you see some other issues with IT solutions for governments. But in terms of the costs versus the results, I think you don't see, there's certainly the attractiveness. China is seen in Latin America as secure. And so, well, if you sacrifice individual privacy, maybe you get Chinese security. That's the dream. But I think what you see is there's some subtle risks. So in Venezuela, for example, with Carnet de la Patria, in Ecuador with ECU 911, in BOL 110 in Bolivia, it was actually exposed in Ecuador that under Correa, they used ECU 911 to spy on Ecuadorians. Probably the best example from a public diplomacy standpoint is what happened in Cuba. There, the Huawei supplied telecommunications system was used by the Cuban firm Ectesa in repressing and cutting off protesters from each other, part of the Cuban government's response in July 2021. So there are issues, and of course the issue always is, given the tendency to leaders who consolidate political power to want to control protesters and things like that, the danger that Chinese technology solutions create a risk by leaders with absolute power. And then finally, influence. I think, to me, the Chinese don't have influence of positive influence, do this political thing, vote with us at the UN, the way that social scientists often measure it. To me, the subtle influence is openness to Chinese projects. And really the key thing is silencing. In other words, leaders, in hope of not losing access to benefits, they don't want to talk about Xinjiang. They don't want to talk about the militarization of the South China Sea. They don't want to talk about China's role in corporate social responsibility. And so that selective silencing in many ways disarms Latin America disarms Latin American governments in pursuing their agenda where they get the best value added and retain their autonomy. So to me, it's important to identify the precise nature of the risks that influence, and not just kind of overall, but great questions.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. I think overall, the United States particularly do not see Africa as sort of a very lucrative ground for military sales generally. And that means they sort of let Russia and China have their way. That's the way I see it, I think, because relatively, you could say America had better markets for its military sales. Now, what the so actually China has sort of been eating more of the Russian pie in terms of military sales than even the US. And I think with what has happened recently with Sudan and the Russian war, I think there's a bit more caution now that there might be a point, and I think that's an interesting point, at which certain procurements, military procurements, because there's an understanding of a certain linkage between the conflict in Sudan and the proposed port, the proposed base, which the Russians wanted to build. I think that understanding of where would we say there's a point where beyond which then our procurement becomes a risk to us as a country. I think that is where Sudan reached, and I think there's countries are observing to ensure that they don't get to that point. On the cost, I don't think there's so much worry about hidden cost. What I've heard from the practitioners is just very practical aspects of interoperability. So whenever they buy equipment, they just simply want to make sure if the Chinese can provide equipment that can probably in another few years' time use Russian spare parts and so on, then it's they buy it. Actually, the kind of military like equipment that I looked at or I've been looking at is not one that is advertised. And I mean, it's done by the civil sort of DoD kind of committees for procurement. So it's very much government led. It's just government saying we'll buy from here or we'll buy from here. But in terms of things for smart cities, like for the heat vision, I think actually American companies don't want to even bid in those kinds of projects because of their perceived citizen surveillance implications. So and Chinese companies don't have concerns about that. So they often get the contracts.
Okay.
I just want to add that I have a one-pager there with two reports that we delivered just a few weeks ago. One of them is about China defense cooperation in Central America and the Caribbean. The bad thing is that it's only in Spanish. We're open to donation for the translation into English. And we have another one about the current approach of Russia in Central America. So you can go to the barcode and scan the access to the reports. I'm not quite sure if we have the possibility of measuring the impact of the Chinese cooperation at least in Central America. I mean, as I showed you before, the first country opening relation with China was Costa Rica, 2007, under a bunch of promises. They have a huge deficit, and when you see the investment that they promise through loans or donation, I mean, you don't see any impact in the economical condition of the people or the communities. Through our digital media journalist program, we published a report about El Salvador and the new dock that China is building there, just about to finish. And the journalist went to San Salvador, and because he wanted to understand the impact of that project around the city, around the town, no? And basically the people say, no, there's no impact. Why? Because all the workers are from China. We are not even authorized to sell food because they bring their own food. So the lady selling tortillas and empanadas, she couldn't sell any with the worker because all of them are from China. I think that is the pattern in Central America. But the big thing is that the good thing is that because this kind of new relation we have with China and Central America is good. We are in a good position. Why? Because precisely because of the activities like this. I mean, from Central America, we are connecting with experts from South America that already had experience dealing with China and they are providing us a lot of information about how to deal with Chinese cooperation, and that is allowing us to create like a space, like a kind of a awareness system with the local elites in the region. Unfortunately, the elites, they want China. They really want China because of what we say here, because the condition that USA is imposing to those countries, they are not happy with that. So China is the route, China is the way for them, and that won't change the next few years. So, but again, it's really hard to measure the impact that we are having with China assistance and cooperation there, because it's new and because it's much more about huge project. As I said before, China made a donation in El Salvador for the construction of a $40 million library. I mean, in El Salvador, in the downtown, a $40 million library. People from civil society, journalists, they asked to the government, hey, instead of one big building of $40 million, you may construct, probably, you may go and construct and make the construction of 40 libraries across the country that would cost less than $1 million. But China, they want that. They want that kind of project. And we have in Central America, we have few room to negotiate with them. I mean, a friend of mine from Honduras, from the Chamber of Commerce, told me, Javier, we don't have to kick out Taiwan because we can keep, I mean, the idea is to keep diplomatic relation, and commercial relation with China, and keep also commercial relation with Taiwan. No, sir, China will not allow that. But yeah, but Chile, they do. They have that. And also, I don't know what country in South America, yeah, because they have room for negotiation. We don't have any room with them. They will tell you, no, Taiwan needs to leave the country. I asked one of our journalists about go to the commercial office of Taiwan in Costa Rica, because in my consideration, they had one there. And after 3 days, no, there is no commercial office, business office of Taiwan in Costa Rica. What in Central America? That is a more sophisticated country in Central America, in the region. So that is the situation we have with China. There's no option for negotiation. They will impose what they want to do. And the autocrat will be happy with that, because that is the way that they can sell prosperity to the people in the region. So it's a problem. In terms of security, I don't see right now a huge impact of China in the region, but as I said before, that doesn't mean that will not happen something later. The surveillance system, I would say that finally, as some of us has been saying here, what you do with the surveillance system, with the support of China, coming from China, will depend entirely of the country. I mean, we had situation. We are just about to publish a case study from Ecuador, and the idea is to provide an analysis and information about what's happened in the last 10 years with the cooperation coming from China and Ecuador. We just published a report about Panama. I will recommend to read the report. And we'll also finish a report for the case of Argentina. And in the case of Costa Rica and Nicaragua and those countries, everything will depend the way the country will do, what they will do with the cooperation, with the assistance. I mean, it's not the fault of China that Mel Zelaya and his wife, Xiomara Castro, will use Huawei technology to the experience of the political opposition. I mean, that's not the business of China. It's not a business of China. It's a business of the government. But also, the additional problem we have with that is that bad China obligate our countries to sign the contract under clause of secrecy. And this is a problem for the civil society, for the independent journalists, for any organization that is concerned about what is going to happen with the cooperation coming from China with this regime that they really want to crash the civil society and cancel any kind of political liberty in Central America.
Thank you very much. With the minute that we have left, let's go to Obert. Is he still online? Just to give him an opportunity for 2 minutes. Obert Hodzi, has he? Oh, he's offline? Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time is up, but we'll continue networking over lunch. Javier, Nelson Mandela tried. He tried to have Taiwan and the PRC in South Africa, negotiated back and forth for many years, but ultimately he gave in to the PRC. So it's a critical. He almost succeeded, but even he had to give in to the PRC. So Javier, Evan, Elijah, Obert, thank you very much. This was an excellent panel, and I'm sure we'll have lots of discussions going forward. Thank you.